Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Concordia's Matthew Swift and Omeed Malik of 1789 Capital.
Omeed, it's great to have you here, and thank you for coming to the 15th Concordia Annual Summit, your first Concordia Summit, hopefully,
That's right, yeah.
of many.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about 1789 Capital and what you have developed and what you're in the process of building, because I think so much has changed so dramatically in terms of how we talk about investing and its connection to the country and its link to issues such as national security. And so tell us a little bit about what you're doing with 1789.
Yeah, probably the origin story is most relevant. What catalyzed us to name a investment fund after the year that the Bill of Rights was introduced. Because necessarily by doing that, you're showing that there's a nexus between politics and finance and accepting that. We're very comfortable with that. In fact, I think it had been going on for a long time, but it hadn't really been addressed. It was almost like an elephant in the room that really since 2010 or so, ESG policies had become very intertwined with asset management. So much so that certain funds would tout themselves to certain blue state pensions about how they'd only invest in clean energy. I mean, that's inherently political if you think about it, especially when you look at the whole ecosystem of investing and asset management and that relationship between state pensions and hedge funds. And so around the height of the Biden administration, probably 2022, we started to not only get concerned about that paradigm, but also what we saw to be overt and covert acts by the federal government to deplatform conservatives, using large big tech incumbents in order to do their dirty work, which in our mind was a backdoor way of inhibiting the First Amendment in many cases. So our idea was to use private capital outside of government to finance kind of more pro-market, free market solutions that were going to stand up as a bulwark to our Bill of Rights, which is why it was called 1789. And to that end, we've used various mechanisms in finance in order to facilitate that. We make use of SPACs. We've done a few notable SPAC transactions where we've taken companies public that represent either an alternative to a large incumbent or enhancing our first, or in some cases just a few weeks ago, our Second Amendment rights. We took a gun retailer public on the New York Stock Exchange. And then in furtherance of just a broader vision, we've articulated our own acronym, not ESG, but EIG, which stands for Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Growth. And that's the way that we're trying to invest. We look at most companies to see whether or not they're going to enhance the security or prosperity of the United States. And of course, now that fits very nicely what the Trump administration wants to do.
How do you evaluate, though, when you're looking at investable opportunities, what are some of the things you immediately look for to see how it aligns with the interests of the United States?
Well, there's an easy, quick screen. So if you have like a DEI or ESG program, you're probably not going to be right for us, and that's okay. So that's a way to kind of negate certain investments. Other than that, though, we have very standard KPIs. We're looking for $10 billion TAMs, whether the company's growing more than 25% year over year, that there's a path to profitability. And in the case of our fund, 1789 Capital, which is our flagship, we're looking for an exit within 2 or 3 years. So it's late stage investing with best-in-class companies. Particularly in this environment, we look to a few areas that we think are very important that also fit in very nicely this narrative that I described. Defense tech is certainly an area we can talk a little bit about. AI, and also a derivative of that, the chip manufacturing that has to occur, as well as rare earth minerals. We've made investments in every single one of those spaces in order to further the security and prosperity of the United States.
When you look at the United States right now, and we talk, for instance, about critical minerals, what do you say to someone who says, we've pretty much lost that battle to China?
Well, I mean, that's a very depressing comment, first of all, to hear that. But it also, I think, explains why we need to do what we're doing and, of course, what the Trump administration is doing. So I don't think I'm saying anything that hasn't already been publicly disclosed, which is to say that our negotiations with China hit a snag with the amount of leverage we had over them for precisely this reason. Rare earth minerals, magnets, this is a big problem. They have almost a monopoly on that space, and so much of what we depend on is mined over there or in some of these other countries that they've got a lot of influence in. It's a national security issue for us to allow that, and we've got to be able to catch up. So to that end, we do have a company that we invest in our portfolio called Vulcan Elements that's trying to bring that back home on the rare earth side. And I think that's the kind of spirit and desire that the Trump administration has. Sometimes people, I think, either disingenuously or superficially criticize them by saying, well, we don't want to make widgets again, or what are you talking about bringing back manufacturing? It's antiquated. Well, no, you want to bring back a few areas. One, the most innovative technologies should be made here because we want to win the battle and race for them. But in addition, anything that affects national security for the United States should also be made in our own borders. Like, I like to say that if you outsource your supply chain, then you have no true sovereignty. And that's what I've observed for some of the more globalist policies that have been implemented over the last 20 years. They have not actually benefited the US. So this could expand not only into some of the areas I already described, but even things like pharmaceutical manufacturing. You shouldn't make your drugs at the home of an adversary. And again, all of this, I think, was really brought to light during COVID, where you saw, again, we had very little leverage over the Chinese because of how dependent we were on them in so many of these critical areas. So we have to change that, and that's how I answer your question, is we can't accept that we've ceded these things. We have to put a full-throated effort into making sure we're going to compete against them. And that's also why you're seeing certain steps being taken by the administration, like taking a stake in Intel and others, that are all designed to try to combat that.
Are you surprised by that, the push to take a stake? Because I think if you had told me, name whomever would be president that was taking a stake in a company in that fashion, I would probably say, well, that sounds like a Bernie Sanders kind of idea.
No doubt, except that here's the, I think, retort to that. Again, high level, weird that the government's taking a stake in a private company.
Yeah.
Totally accept that. But go to the next step. Actually, what happened there? Intel was already receiving billions of dollars effectively under the Biden administration for free to say, hey, we're just going to grant you this, do what you like. And being the businessmen that Trump, Lutnick, and Bessent are, they actually said, well, why are we doing that without getting anything in return? We should actually have an equity stake if we're going to give you money. That, to me, is common sense. But that's how they look at everything from the perspective of business people. And again, that was the problem with the Biden administration in the case of both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, is neither of them had ever worked in the private sector. They have no concept of actually getting a return on an investment, which people in the business community do. And so actually, I think it was quite smart that they did that. We should not just basically engage in welfare with nothing in return for these companies. If we're going to get money, then actually, in this case, the shareholder, which is the American taxpayer, should get a benefit back for that. So I actually think it's genius.
What do you say to a CEO of a company you're looking to invest in that says, yeah, but Omeed, we can manufacture this in Mexico for 1/3 of the price. You're essentially ensuring we can't survive as a company.
Yeah. So again, a premise that's troubling, that we've decided that to the detriment of the American middle class, we're going to outsource these kinds of jobs. So that's more of a philosophical point. Just to answer it on a more practical manner, I'm actually not against what you described. What I'm saying is that I think it's a kind of, first there's a mentality that has to shift, that is it really in our benefit? Has the globalized economy really benefited America? When you hear a lot of statistics that are thrown around over the last 20 years about how a rising tide lifts all boats, we've taken so many people out of poverty, and that's probably true on a global basis. But the fact that I or our policymakers have helped create a Chinese middle class to the detriment of the United States and Western Europe is probably not a good thing if you're a steward of that country. And I think that's what Trump's speech was yesterday about in the United Nations, was these policies where you take these developed industrialized nations and you import all of this immigration, in many cases illegal, actually depresses wages and hurts the ability of the middle class to have a life. And we've seen that in the data. Western Europe and the United States' middle class has been adversely affected by these policies. So what we're trying to do is to take steps in order to rectify that, which I think any responsible leader should do for their own country. Now, again, to just answer your point more specifically, I'm more concerned about outsourcing our entire supply chain to a place like China, much less so an allied nation like Mexico. So when you try to outsource your supply chain to effectively a hostile power who has 4 times your population, engages in slave labor, has now potentially the second, almost first largest economy, and is nuclear powered, that's not smart. And that's not Mexico.
How have you, I hear what you're saying, and I think so much has changed so quickly from a policy perspective, from the state of American politics. You look even at the way diplomacy is done. Even some of the speakers that have been on stage at this summit, I never imagined. But President Trump has changed relations like that compared to maybe some more traditional diplomatic processes. How have you changed over the last, call it 20 years, in terms of what was the key drivers of your evolution to now where you are today with 1789?
Yeah, I mean, well, I was a Democrat. I lived in New York City for the majority of my professional life until about 2019, 2020. In Trump's first election in 2016 was an eye-opener for me, being a resident of Manhattan. From a personal standpoint, I realized how significant of an adverse impact the financial crisis had on a large swath of this country. If you lived in Manhattan or the Hamptons, you were somewhat immune to that. You didn't really feel it. In fact, I think record bonuses were paid out just a few years after the financial crisis. No one went to jail. And in fact, with Dodd-Frank, we took these too big to fail banks, and the solution was to make them bigger. So effectively, we have a few government-sponsored entities now in our entire banking system. So exactly the opposite of what I think should have happened from a policy perspective. And by the way, that was done under a Democratic administration, Obama, who was really beholden to the big banks. And you're an observer of that, and at the same time, your family members have been sent to two idiotic wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that did nothing and cost us trillions of dollars, and many people died. And then at the end result of the longest war in US history, you put the Taliban back in, which is why you went in to get rid of them in 2001. So, I mean, I don't know why we listen to any generals that were in power at that time. If you're in the business community again, you would have been fired for your performance. So I think it's a realization that academically, either neoliberal thinking that I embraced at the turn of the century, and even before that is when it became in vogue, was when the Soviet Union fell, was that we were going to be able to create democracy around the world by exporting capitalism. Sounds academically very interesting in the early 90s, but then you start playing through it, and it's not so much that I change. I think you look at data, and then you introduce the Chinese in 2000 to the World Trade Organization, I think around that time as well, and you start implementing the policies we're talking about under both administrations. Trump came in and called all of that into question. And at first blush, people might think he was being reactionary, but in fact, as we now see, because the MAGA movement has developed into a very coherent ideological point of view that is taking root in many other countries, it makes sense. A lot of what we did not help the citizens of the country. And so when we talk about an evolution, going from becoming a Democrat to supporting Trump, it's because I think the Democrats lost their way. And on both sides, the establishment lost their way. And what he's been doing so, I think, magnificently, is calling into question a lot of the things that we took for granted that have not actually turned out the way we hoped that they would have 20 years ago. And I think any educated person should look at data and shift their minds. Who cares what party it's associated with, as long as it's the right thing for the country you live in? That's the way I look at it.
But to that point, though, with 1789, explain, how do you navigate when Republicans are not in the White House? How do you envision 1789 operating with the mission you have that's so clearly aligned with an administration's policy when it's a Democrat?
Well, we started the fund when there was a Democrat in power, so we know what that's like. And in fact, we started right in the middle of the Biden administration. But do you know when Fox News had its best ratings?
When?
During Obama's 8 years. So this is an all-weather strategy. The philosophies or ideology and our commitment to the best-in-class companies that are going to enhance the security and prosperity of the United States, or EIG as I've called it, are always going to be in favor in my mind, regardless if there's a Democrat in there or a Republican. And how bad would it be and telling would it be on the Democrats if they didn't support what we're doing? And I think that in of itself is the issue that the Democrats have, which is why their brand is at an all-time low, because they have not embraced the patriotism that the private sector needs to, and I like to call it patriotic capitalism. And that's the whole thing with tariffs. It's like people think it was silly or whatever. Well, the inflation didn't happen after he started tariffing it, and we're actually reducing our deficit by bringing hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy. And if tariffs are so dumb, why did every other country tariff us? Again, common sense. So yes, there's an element of what we're saying that's somewhat ideological, but quite frankly, I think what we're doing is good for the country and is common sense. And I hope that that would transcend whether it would be so unfortunate to have a Democratic president.
All right. Well, Omeed Malik, thank you very, very much. This was a great conversation.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.